I am Julian Vaughn, 71 years old, and I am invisible to my own son. He summoned me to the reading of my ex-wife's $34 million will, not out of respect, but out of spite. He wanted a front-row seat to my final humiliation. I watched him smirk as the lawyer read the clause, leaving me exactly $1. "That's what you're worth," he whispered to his wife, loud enough for me to hear. He thought he had won. He didn't know about the second document the lawyer was holding. Before I tell you what that lawyer said next, let me know in the comments where you are listening to my story from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that dignity is worth more than any amount of money. The sound of the dripping faucet was driving me crazy. Drip, drip, drip. It was a rhythm of failure. At 71, a man should be sitting on his own porch, not kneeling on the cracked linoleum of a rented apartment in Anacostia trying to wrestle a corroded pipe fitting. My hands, thick with arthritis, just don't have the torque they used to. I was covered in rust and sweat when my phone started buzzing on the counter, rattling against an old coffee mug. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked at the screen. Andre. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Andre never calls. Not his old man. In his world, I barely exist. He'll send a generic happy birthday text in March, usually 2 days late. But a call only means one of two things: he wants something or someone is dead. I tapped the screen. "Hello? Dad." His voice was cold, formal, like he was calling a vendor. "I have some news." I sat back on my heels. The floor was cold. "What is it, son?" "It's Mother. She passed away last week. A severe stroke." I leaned against the kitchen cabinet. The air left my lungs. "Last week." The words came out quiet, hollow. "Andre, she died a week ago. Why am I just hearing this now?" There was a silence on the line. Not a sad silence, an annoyed one. I could hear him sigh as if my question was an inconvenience. "I've been busy, Dad, handling the arrangements. The service was small, just family. It was efficient." Efficient. That's the word he used for his mother's funeral. I closed my eyes. It wasn't grief I felt for Denise. Not really. 40 years of divorce drains all that away. What I felt was a profound, chilling emptiness. My only son hadn't just forgotten to call me. He had decided not to. I wasn't just family. I was a loose end. "I see," I said. The dripping from the faucet suddenly seemed deafening. "Anyway," Andre continued, his voice all business again, "that's not the main reason I'm calling. The reading of the will is on Friday, 10 a.m. You need to be there." I blinked, confused. "Me, Andre, what are you talking about? Your mother and I, we haven't been married in 4 decades. I have no claim to her estate. There's no reason for me to be there." Denise had made sure of that. When we split, she got the house in Georgetown, the portfolio, the connections. And she got Andre. I got my tools and a small apartment on the wrong side of the river. She had spent the last 40 years meticulously erasing me from her life and from our sons. "I know that," Andre said, and for the first time I heard an edge in his voice. A sliver of satisfaction. It sounded dark. "Look, I'm just telling you what the lawyer said. Mr. Rowe, he said your presence is mandatory." Mandatory. That doesn't make any sense. I heard a muffled voice in the background. A sharp female whisper. It was Bethany, his wife. That ambitious, cold woman who always looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. She was the one who had convinced Andre that his old man, the retired civil engineer, was an embarrassment. "Just tell him," I heard her hiss. Andre cleared his throat. "Mother left specific instructions regarding you. Mr. Rowe was very clear. The will cannot be executed and no assets can be distributed unless you are physically present to hear it read." A cold dread sharper than grief settled over me. This wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Denise. She was always one for the grand, cruel gesture, even from the grave. She wasn't including me, she was trapping me. "She's forcing me to come," I whispered. "It's not a request, Dad," Andre said. His voice was flat. 10 a.m. The offices of Rowe, Strickland, and Hayes, downtown. He paused, and I could practically hear the smirk. "Try to wear a decent suit, please. Don't embarrass me." The line clicked. He was gone. I sat there on the cold floor for a long time. The rusty water from the pipe had formed a small dirty puddle around my knee. My son hadn't called to tell me his mother was dead. He had called to tell me to show up for one final act of humiliation. Denise was rich. Filthy rich. We had started with nothing, just two kids from Howard University with big dreams. I built my construction company, Vaughn Construction, from the ground up. I built half the suburbs in Northern Virginia. I was the one who made that fortune. And in the end, she was the one who kept it. Now she was dead. And she had left me instructions. I knew as sure as I was breathing what this was. This was Denise's last laugh. This was Andre and Bethany's chance to finally publicly put me in my place. To show the world that Julian Vaughn, the man who built an empire, was being left with nothing. Not even a memory. I grabbed the wrench. Mandatory, I muttered to myself. I didn't care about her money. I had made my peace with that 40 years ago. But my son's voice, the cold satisfaction in it, that hurt. He wasn't just inviting me to a will reading, he was inviting me to my own execution. And the worst part, he was looking forward to it. I stood up, my knees cracking. "All right, Denise," I said to the empty room. "All right, I'll be there." I would wear my suit, the only one I had, and I would go and hear what she had to say. I owed myself that. I had to see my son's face when he finally got everything he ever wanted. I stood in front of the small mirror on my closet door. Friday morning, 10 a.m. was the appointment. It was 9:15. My hands were shaking slightly as I straightened the knot on my tie. It was a simple maroon silk, the only one I owned that wasn't frayed. The suit was navy blue wool. I had bought it 25 years ago for the 20th anniversary gala of Vaughn Construction, my company, back when my name was chiseled onto foundation stones, back when I was a man who built things. The suit was clean. I had spent an hour the night before brushing it down. But it was old. The fabric was thin at the elbows, and it pulled tight across my shoulders. I looked respectable, but I also looked like a relic, a ghost haunting his own life. I didn't own a car, hadn't in over a decade. A car is a constant drain, a luxury I couldn't justify. My legs work fine. I walked the 3 blocks to the bus stop on Martin Luther King Avenue, the collar of my old overcoat turned up against the chilly wind. The ride downtown took 45 minutes. I watched the city I helped build slide past the window. I watched the familiar neighborhoods of my world, Anacostia, give way to the imposing stone and glass towers of power and money. With every mile, the knot in my stomach tightened. What was Denise's final move, this mandatory attendance? It was a piece of theater. Was she going to have Andre offer me some pathetic monthly stipend just to watch me refuse? The thought of my son, her puppet, looking at me with pity was worse than any insult. I almost got off the bus. Almost. But then I thought of Andre's voice on the phone. That cold satisfaction. No, I would see this through. The offices of Rowe, Strickland and Hayes were on the 12th floor of a building that seemed to be made entirely of dark glass. The elevator was silent, rising so fast my ears popped. The doors opened onto a reception area that was larger than my entire apartment. The carpet was so thick my old shoes sank into it. It smelled of lemon oil, old leather, and money so old it had forgotten what $1 was worth. A young receptionist looked up, her smile polite but instantly dismissive. "Can I help you, sir? I'm Julian Vaughn. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Rowe." Her eyes widened just a fraction. She hadn't expected me. "Ah, yes, Mr. Vaughn. They are waiting for you." She led me down a long, impossibly quiet hallway. The walls were paneled in dark, gleaming mahogany. She opened a heavy door, and there they were, Andre and Bethany. They were in a vast conference room with a window that looked out over the Capitol building. They were dressed like the stars of a tragedy. Andre wore a custom-tailored black suit that must have cost $5,000. Bethany, my daughter-in-law, was in a sleek black dress, a simple, perfect string of pearls at her throat. They looked rich. They looked powerful. And they looked annoyed. I had kept them waiting. Andre was scrolling through his phone, a deep frown of concentration on his face. He glanced up as I entered, and his eyes did a quick, dismissive scan. My suit, my shoes, my face. His lip twitched just a fraction. He didn't stand up. He didn't say hello. He just looked back down at his phone. It's a terrible, hollowing thing when your own son looks at you and you see nothing. No love, no hate, not even recognition. Just assessment and disappointment. Bethany, however, was all performance. She stood and glided over to me, a mask of gentle sorrow on her face. "Julian," she said, and her voice was like honey mixed with tiny sharp pieces of glass. "I'm so glad you could make it." She placed her cold, manicured hand on the sleeve of my old suit. Her eyes did the same scan Andre's had, but hers were slower, more insulting. "It's a difficult time," I managed to say. "Oh, of course," she cooed, patting my arm as if I were a child or a pet. "And the trip over, it must have been an absolute ordeal for you. Did the bus give you any trouble? I know those routes can be so unpredictable." There it was, the casual drive-by cruelty, the swift poisonous reminder that I was the poor relation, the charity case who had to navigate public transport to be in her rarefied air. Andre didn't look up from his phone, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch again. He approved. I gently removed my arm from her grasp. "I managed just fine, Bethany. Thank you." I sat down at the far end of the massive table. The polished wood felt cold beneath my hands. The silence stretched, broken only by the aggressive, rhythmic tapping of Andre's thumb on his phone screen. I looked at my son. 45 years old, a stranger in an expensive suit. When was the last time he'd even been to my apartment, I had to think. It was 6, maybe 7 months ago. He'd shown up unannounced on a Saturday afternoon. He hadn't come to visit. He'd come to take something. My old German-made set of drafting tools, the ones I'd used to design my very first building back in 1978. "I'd like to frame them for my office, Dad," he'd said, all charm and false sentiment. "You know, for posterity, a little family history." He'd been so convincing. 2 weeks later, I saw the exact set, unmistakable, sold at an online auction for vintage engineering equipment. He hadn't even waited. He just took a piece of my soul and sold it for pocket money. And here he was, about to inherit a fortune. The conference room door opened again, and the entire mood of the room shifted. A man my own age, tall and rail-thin, entered. He was African-American like me, and he wore his dignity like a perfectly tailored suit. His suit was impeccable, but not flashy. This was Gideon Rowe. He'd been our family lawyer 40 years ago, back when we were a family. His face was unreadable, his eyes sharp. They missed nothing. He looked at Andre and Bethany, who had both sat up straight, their phones suddenly gone. "Mr. Vaughn, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, a curt professional nod. Then his eyes found me sitting alone at the end of the table. He paused. He walked the entire length of the table past them and extended his hand directly to me. "Julian," he said, and his voice was firm, deep. "It has been a very long time. I am glad you are here." He didn't offer condolences for Denise. He was all business. He shook my hand, a proper firm grip that said, "I see you." In that one simple gesture, he gave me more respect than my son had shown me in a decade. He returned to the head of the table and sat opening a thick, leather-bound file. "We are all present," he said. "Let us begin. I will be reading the last will and testament of Denise Landry, dated 18 months ago." He put on a pair of silver-framed reading glasses. He didn't rush. He read through the initial legal declarations, the boilerplate language about being of sound mind. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it echo off the polished wood. I just wanted this to be over. "We will skip the minor bequests," Mr. Rowe said, his voice a flat monotone. "Jewelry to her sister, various donations to her alma mater, and we will move to the primary estate." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "After all outstanding debts are settled, the total remaining value of the estate, comprising real estate in Georgetown and Martha's Vineyard, stock portfolios, bonds, and liquid assets, is valued at $34,212,450. I heard Bethany suck in a sharp breath. Andre finally put his phone away. He sat bolt upright. I saw him reach across the table and squeeze his wife's hand. His knuckles were white. Mr. Rowe looked up over the top of his glasses directly at Andre. "As per Mrs. Landry's wishes, this entire sum, the full remainder of her estate, is to be transferred to a trust established for her beloved and only son, Andre Vaughn." Andre closed his eyes, a look of pure beatific relief washing over his face. Bethany beamed, her eyes shining. It was done. And then Andre opened his eyes. He turned his head, and he looked right at me. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just stared. It was a look of cold, final, absolute victory. This was the moment. This was the reason he had made me come. He wanted me to sit here in my old, worn-out suit and watch him become a king. He wanted me to know without a shadow of a doubt that I was nothing. I held his gaze. I felt the blood drain from my face. The humiliation was absolute. It was complete. The room was absolutely silent. The only sound was the faint whir of the ventilation system. Andre just stared at me, his eyes wide, bright, and utterly merciless. That look said everything. It said, you see what you are. You are nothing. I am everything. It's over. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to lower my eyes, to flinch, to show the pain. I felt the heat rising in my face, the sting of humiliation behind my eyes. But I would not give him the satisfaction. I held his gaze. I would not be the first to look away. It was Gideon Rowe who broke the spell. He cleared his throat. That, Mr. Rowe said, his voice still a flat monotone, covers the distribution of the primary estate. We now have one final addendum, a specific bequest. Andre finally broke his stare, turning to the lawyer with a slight frown. This he hadn't expected, but Bethany just relaxed in her chair, a little sigh of contentment escaping her. She crossed her legs, leaned back, and looked at me. This was the part she was waiting for. This was the dessert. An addendum, Mr. Rowe continued, turning a page. Yes, a specific instruction regarding my ex-husband, Mr. Julian Vaughn. Andre's head snapped back toward me. The look of triumph was gone, replaced by a dark, eager anticipation. This was it. This was the reason I was mandatory. Mr. Rowe took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked down at the page and read, To Julian Vaughn. He began, his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. My first husband. The man who proved himself to be a catastrophic failure in business and an even greater disappointment as a father. A man whose incompetence cost us our first company and whose weakness cost me 40 years of having to rebuild a life from the scraps he left behind. Every word was a hammer blow. I could feel Bethany's eyes on me, drinking in my reaction. I kept my face a mask of stone. I stared at a small polished knot in the mahogany table. Mr. Rowe continued, I have been advised by my counsel that to prevent any frivolous legal challenge to this, my final testament, I must not omit him entirely. Therefore, I bequeath to Julian Vaughn the sum of exactly $1, and I make it a binding mandatory condition of this will that he be present in person to hear this bequest read aloud. I want him to sit in that room. I want him to look my son in the eye. I want him to hear in front of witnesses exactly what his life's legacy is worth. Mr. Rowe's voice stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. And that, Mr. Rowe said, is the final bequest. Bethany couldn't hold it in. A small, sharp sound like a snort escaped her. She quickly brought her hand to her mouth, but it was too late. Her shoulders were shaking. She was trying not to laugh out loud. Andre didn't even try to hide it. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. He leaned forward just slightly. He looked right at me, his eyes gleaming, and he whispered just loud enough for me, for his wife, and for the lawyer to hear. $1. He shook his head, a parody of sadness. That's what you get. After all this time. Nothing. He sat back, folding his hands on the table, the picture of a man who had just inherited the world. He had his money, he had his victory, and he had his humiliation of me. It was perfect, and in that moment something inside me didn't break. It shifted. I was numb, but not from the insult. The words failure and incompetence echoed in my head, but they sounded wrong, like a lie. A deep, fundamental 40-year-old lie. I wasn't thinking about the dollar. I was thinking about the 34 million. My mind, the mind of an engineer, the mind of a builder, was running calculations. It was pulling up blueprints from a dusty, locked archive. I suddenly remembered 1978. I remembered standing on a muddy field in Fairfax County holding the plans for our first big subdivision. I remembered the all-night meetings with lenders. I remembered the concrete pours at dawn. I remembered the smell of sawdust and welding torches. I remembered that. I was there. Where was Denise? She was there. But she was planning the parties. She was designing the logos. She was picking out the furniture for the model homes. She was good at that. But she wasn't on the scaffolding at midnight in a rainstorm. She wasn't negotiating with the union bosses. She wasn't fighting off the inspectors. I built Vaughn Construction, and when we split, she kept it. I let her keep it. For Andre. That was the story I had told myself. That was the story she had told me. That I had failed, that I had mismanaged it, and that her business sense was what saved the assets. I had let her say it. I had let her believe it. And God help me, I had started to believe it too. I had let her and my son define me as a failure for 40 years. I looked at the $34 million sitting in Andre's pocket, and I realized that wasn't her money. That was my money. That was the blood and sweat and steel I had poured into the ground. That was my legacy, the legacy she had just spat on, the legacy she had just bought for $1. I was so lost in this sudden crushing revelation that I almost missed it. I slowly lifted my head, my mind reeling. I looked at Andre basking in his victory. I looked at Bethany wiping a tear of mirth from her eye, and then I looked at Gideon Rowe. I expected him to be closing the file. I expected him to be shuffling papers, to be standing up, to be congratulating my son. He was doing none of those things. He was perfectly still. He was looking right at me. He had been watching me. He had seen the shock. He had seen the calculation. He had seen the dawning, horrifying realization in my eyes. And then Gideon Rowe did the strangest thing. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was the smallest, slightest upturn of the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of pity. It wasn't a smile of congratulations for Andre. It was sharp. It was intelligent. It was satisfied. He looked from me to Andre. "Well," Mr. Rowe said, his voice suddenly lighter, almost cheerful. "That settles that." Andre, still smiling, nodded. "Yes, I believe it does. If you'll have your office." "Oh no, Mr. Vaughn," Gideon Rowe interrupted, and his smile widened just a fraction. "I mean, it settles Mrs. Landry's will. It clarifies it perfectly." Andre frowned. "Clarifies what's to clarify? It's done." "It's done," Mr. Rowe agreed. "And her final declaration, her reason for leaving Mr. Vaughn, $1, that's the most important part." He tapped the will. "Her testimony that he was a catastrophic failure whose incompetence cost the company. That's exactly what we needed." He turned to me. "Isn't it Julian?" I stared at him, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest for a whole new reason. What was he doing? I don't understand," I said. Gideon Rowe finally closed the file, but he didn't put it away. He set it neatly on the table. "You don't understand," he said, "because you don't have this." He leaned down beside his chair and lifted a heavy, old-fashioned leather briefcase. He clicked it open, and he pulled out a second file. This one wasn't new. It was old. It was thick-bound in dark blue faded legal paper and held together by a thick frayed ribbon. It looked ancient. He placed it on the table with a heavy, definitive thud. "Denise's will," Mr. Rowe said, "was about her feelings. This is about the facts." Andre was no longer smiling. "What the hell is that?" Andre stood up. He smoothed the front of his custom-tailored jacket, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He had his 34 million. He had just witnessed my public execution. His day was complete. He nodded curtly at Gideon Rowe. "Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Rowe," Andre said, his voice dripping with condescension as if he were dismissing a servant. "A bit theatrical." He glanced at me, but handled efficiently. "My office will be in touch tomorrow to begin the transfer of assets." Bethany stood beside him, her hand on his arm, a triumphant smirk on her face. She was already mentally redecorating the Georgetown house. She didn't even look at me. It was as if I had already dissolved. I was the $1 a ghost to be stepped over on their way out the door. They turned to leave. "I am not finished, Mr. Vaughn." Gideon Rowe's voice was not loud, but it had the weight of granite. It cut through the air and stopped Andre dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his arrogance faltering, replaced by a flash of simple annoyance. "Excuse me," Andre said. "I believe you are. The will has been read. The bequests are clear." Bethany chimed in, her voice like fake sugar. "Yes, Mr. Rowe, my husband has been named the sole beneficiary, and my father-in-law," she giggled a tiny, cruel sound, "has been given his $1. What more could there possibly be to discuss?" Mr. Rowe didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes locked on Andre. "Please, sit down." It was not a request. It was a command. Andre hesitated, his jaw tightening. He looked at Bethany, then back at Rowe. He was a man who was used to giving orders, not taking them, but something in Rowe's stare held him. Slowly, reluctantly, he sat back down. Bethany plopped into her chair beside him, huffing with visible impatience. "This is highly irregular," Andre said, trying to regain his footing. "What is this about if you're trying to bill us for more time?" "This," Mr. Rowe said, and he tapped the old faded blue file, the one he had just pulled from his briefcase. This is about the assets you were just discussing. Andre laughed, a short, nervous bark. That's some old keepsake from my father's failed life. Look, if you're trying to find some loophole, the will was explicit. This, Mr. Rowe said again, sliding the heavy file into the center of the massive table with a definitive thud, is not a keepsake. Mrs. Landry's will, he gestured to the other newer document, was a statement of her feelings. This is a statement of facts. His hands were steady as he untied the frayed ribbon. The string made a dry, whispering sound as it came loose. He opened the cover. The pages inside were yellowed, almost brittle at the edges, covered in dense, old-fashioned typewriter print and stamped with notary seals I hadn't seen in decades. "What is that?" Bethany demanded, her voice sharp. "Old divorce papers, it doesn't matter. They were divorced for 40 years. Whatever that is, it's irrelevant and superseded by the will." "On the contrary, Mrs. Vaughn, it is the only thing that is relevant," Rowe said. He looked directly at Andre, who was now leaning forward, his confident smirk completely gone, replaced by a mask of wary confusion. Mr. Rowe held up the top page. "This is the 1985 Vaughn-Landry Irrevocable Trust Agreement." The words hung in the air. Vaughn-Landry, Irrevocable Trust. Andre and Bethany just stared. The words meant nothing to them, but to me, it was like a jolt of electricity from a downed power line. A memory dark and terrifying flashed in my mind. A different office, a different time. Me, 31 years old, my hands shaking, my world collapsing. Denise not cruel then, but terrified, crying. And Gideon Rowe, a young, sharp lawyer in his late 20s, his face grim. I remembered signing something. I remembered a feeling of profound, sickening loss, like I was cutting off my own arm to save my life. I had buried that memory. I had buried it so deep I thought it was gone forever. I started, my voice a dry croak. "What trust?" Andre scoffed, trying to sound dismissive, but his voice cracked. "My mother never mentioned any trust, other than the one she just left me, of course. She controlled every penny. That document is meaningless. It's old." "She controlled it, yes," Mr. Rowe agreed, his voice dangerously calm. "She managed it for 40 years. She managed it brilliantly. She grew the $8 million you all started with into the $34,212,000 that are in her accounts today." My head snapped up. 8 million. I remembered that number. I remembered it to the dollar. 8 million, Andre said, leaning forward. "What are you talking about?" "My mother built that fortune. She told me he pointed at me, his finger trembling with anger. Bankrupted his company. She said she had to save the scraps. That's what her will just said." "Yes," Mr. Rowe said, and I saw that cold, satisfied smile return. "That is what she said. Her final written testimony that Julian here was a catastrophic failure whose incompetence cost the company. We heard it. It's now on the record." "Exactly," Bethany chimed in, her confidence returning. "She confirmed it. He was a failure. She saved the family. That's her money. The will is valid." "Oh yes, Mrs. Vaughn," Gideon Rowe said, leaning back in his chair. "The will is perfectly valid. In fact, Mrs. Landry's final declaration is the very thing that makes this old trust agreement so powerful. Her statement is what we call testimony against interest. She confirmed the origin of the dispute." Andre's face was pale. The confusion was turning into a cold, creeping dread. He was a finance guy. He understood the word irrevocable. What are you saying?" Andre stammered. "What trust agreement?" Mr. Rowe leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the old blue document. "I'm saying, Mr. Vaughn," he said, his voice dropping, "that the $34 million your mother just left you in her will, legally, was never hers to give." The room exploded. "That's a lie!" Bethany shrieked, jumping to her feet so fast her chair almost toppled over. "You're trying to steal from us. This is conspiracy. He paid you. The old man paid you off. You're a crook." "Bethany, sit down." "Shut up." Andre snapped, his voice tight with panic. He wasn't looking at his wife. He was staring at Gideon Rowe. He knew this was real. "Explain," he hissed. "Now." Gideon Rowe ignored Bethany's outburst completely, as if she were a fly buzzing in the window. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at Andre. He looked only at me. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, pinning me to my chair. He saw the confusion in my eyes, the fragmented, painful memories that were struggling to surface. "Julian," he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the vast silent table. "I know it was a long time ago. I know you buried it. I know what it cost you. But you have to remember now. The truth is finally being told. Think back. Think past the divorce. Think past the failure. Think back to 1985. He paused, and his next words hit me like a physical blow. "Julian, do you remember the TCT lawsuit? TCT. The letters. Taggart Consolidated Trades." Oh God. I remembered. I remembered everything. TCT, Taggart Consolidated Trades. The name hit me like a physical blow. It was as if a door in my mind, one I had welded shut 40 years ago, had just been blasted off its hinges. Suddenly, I wasn't in a gleaming conference room. I was 31 years old again, standing in the rain, watching a sheriff's deputy nail a notice of seizure to the locked gates of my biggest construction site. "No," I whispered. I could feel the blood draining from my face. Andre and Bethany were just staring confused. "TCT, what is that?" Andre demanded. "What does some old lawsuit have to do with my mother's money?" "It has everything to do with it, Mr. Vaughn," Gideon Rose said, his voice sharp as a scalpel. He stood up and began to pace, not like a lawyer, but like a preacher about to deliver a sermon. "You need to understand what your father was," he said, pointing not at me, but at Andre. "You spent your whole life believing your mother's story. That he was a failure, that she was the brains. You have no idea, do you? You have no idea who Julian Vaughn was." He turned to me. "Tell them, Julian." I couldn't. My throat was too tight. "Fine," Rose said. "I'll tell them." He looked back at Andre. "In 1984, your father's company, Vaughn Construction, was the third largest black-owned construction firm on the entire East Coast. He didn't just build houses. He was building power plants. He was building bridges. He was building this city. He was 30 years old and he was a titan." Bethany scoffed. "If he was such a titan, what happened? Where did it all go?" "He got too big," Rowe said, his voice dropping to a low, angry growl. "He got too successful too fast. And he broke the rules. Not the legal rules, the other rules. He was a black man bidding on contracts that were supposed to be reserved for the good old boys. And in 1985, he was the front-runner for the biggest one of all, the Potomac Federal Complex, a $50 million government contract." Andre, the finance guy, sat up. He knew what a $50 million contract in 1985 meant. "He was going to win it," Rowe continued. "His bid was lower, his specs were better, and he had a perfect track record. He was unstoppable. And Taggart Consolidated Trades, TCT, a company run by old white money, they couldn't beat him on merit. So they decided to destroy him." He paused, walking over to the window, looking out over the Capitol. "They didn't sue him for breach of contract. They didn't sue him for money. They sued him for something far more brilliant and far more evil. They launched a coordinated multi-state lawsuit accusing Vaughn Construction of fraud, racketeering, and this was the masterpiece: reverse discrimination. They claimed he was only hiring black-owned subcontractors. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But it didn't matter." "Why?" I heard myself ask. The word was a dry rasp. Rowe looked at me. "You know why, Julian? The feds, the banks, the lawsuit triggered the morality clauses in his federal bid. The bid was suspended pending investigation. It triggered the covenant clauses in his bank loans. His lines of credit, millions of dollars, were frozen. Overnight." "He was ruined," I whispered, remembering the sick falling feeling. "He was attacked," Rowe corrected me, his voice like thunder. "TCT didn't need to win the lawsuit. They just needed to file it. They knew he was leveraged. They knew he had payroll to meet. They bled him dry. Within 6 months, Vaughn Construction, the third largest black-owned firm on the East Coast, was facing total bankruptcy. He was being wiped off the map, not because he was a failure, but because he was a threat." Andre was pale. He was staring at me not with contempt, but with a dawning, horrified confusion. I never knew any of this." "Of course you didn't," Bethany snapped, her panic making her vicious. "It's a fairy tale. He's making it up to try and steal your money. If this was all so unjust, why didn't he fight it? Why did he just fail?" Rowe actually laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Fight it," He did fight. He fought until he had nothing left to fight with. They were burying him in legal fees, but the lawsuit against his company was just part of the plan. The second phase was to come after him personally, to take his house, to take his savings, to make him, his wife, and his young son homeless. He walked back to the table and laid his hand on my shoulder. I flinched. And that, Roe said, his voice quiet now, is when Julian came to my office. Not as a titan, but as a desperate man, a desperate father. He knew he was going to lose the company. He knew he might even face prison on these trumped-up fraud charges. He didn't care about himself. He only cared about two people. He looked at Andre. He cared about your mother, and he cared about you. You were 5 years old. He picked up the old blue file. He came to me and he said, Gideon, they can take the company, they can take my name, they can take my freedom, but I will not let them take my son's future. Roe's voice was thick with an emotion I hadn't heard in 40 years. Respect. So, Roe continued, we devised a plan, a desperate plan, a painful one. The only way to protect his personal assets, the $8 million in stocks and cash he had already saved, was to get them out of his name. Far away from Taggart, far away from the courts. So we executed a legal divorce, on paper only. A fake divorce, Andre whispered. A legal divorce, Roe corrected. And as part of that proceeding, Julian transferred 100% of his personal wealth, every penny he had, to Denise. But, and this is the part your mother seems to have conveniently forgotten for the last 40 years, that transfer was not a settlement, it was not a gift, it was not her money. He held up the blue document. It was governed by this, the irrevocable trust agreement, a binding contract signed by Julian, signed by Denise, and witnessed by me and my partner, a contract that stated in no uncertain terms that Denise Landry was being made the trustee of the $8 million, not the owner. He turned the page. The agreement specified she would manage, hold, and invest the principal for Julian, but that the money itself and all accumulated interest, profits, and growth remained the sole legal and rightful property of Julian Vaughn. My heart was pounding. I had forgotten. I had truly, completely forgotten the details. I had signed the papers, given it all to her, and then walked away to fight TCT. I had walked away, and I had lost, and I was so broken, so ashamed of my failure that I never looked back. I let her keep it. I let her keep the story. This is insane, Bethany stammered, her face white with rage and fear. If this thing is real, why didn't he ever enforce it? Why did he let her keep the money for 40 years? Why did he live in a dump? She spat the word while she was living in Georgetown. It makes no sense. Because he lost, I said. Everyone turned to me. I lost. I repeated, my voice stronger. I fought TCT for 2 more years. I sold everything I had left. I countersued, and I won. The court eventually ruled in my favor. They called the TCT lawsuit frivolous and malicious, but by then, my voice broke. By then it was too late. The company was gone. The contract was gone. My reputation was gone. I was wiped out. I was a failure. No, Gideon Roe said, his voice firm. You were robbed. And when you came back with nothing but the court victory in your hand, you went to Denise. You asked for your money back so you could rebuild. I looked at Andre. She said no. She said I had cost her, that my scandal had humiliated her, that she had saved the $8 million from my incompetence and that it was hers now. She said I was a bad risk, and she told me if I ever mentioned that trust agreement, if I ever tried to take the money, she would make sure I never saw my son again. So you let her keep it, Roe finished. You let her keep $34 million. You let her build a life on top of your money and raise your son to hate you. Also, you could have a text message on your birthday. No, Andre whispered. He was shaking his head as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. No, my mother. She wouldn't do that. She just did, Gideon Roe said, and he tapped the will. She just put it in writing. She confirmed the entire basis of the original conflict. She called him a failure. She called him incompetent. She justified the very separation of assets that this trust agreement was created to protect. And he turned and the full weight of his legal authority fell on Andre. Which brings us back to the $34 million, Mr. Vaughn. You are correct. Your mother's will is perfectly valid, but it's a will for an estate that is currently in massive, massive debt. Bethany's jaw dropped. Debt? What debt? She had $34 million. Gideon Rowe smiled. That cold, satisfied 40-year-in-the-making smile. Yes, she had $34,212,450, and according to this irrevocable trust agreement, she owed every single penny of it to Julian. Andre's voice was a ghost. What does this mean? Exactly. Gideon Rowe looked at my son. The anger was gone from his face. The satisfaction was gone. He looked almost gentle. And that I realized was the most terrifying thing of all. It was the look of a surgeon about to perform a necessary, radical, and agonizing amputation. It means, Mr. Rowe said, and his voice was quiet, that we must proceed, precisely as the law and these documents demand. He reached over and pulled the new pristine file, Denise's will, back in front of him. He placed it directly on top of the old blue trust agreement. Let us be perfectly clear so there is no confusion, he said. Your mother's last will and testament is 100% valid. I saw a flicker, a tiny, insane spark of hope light up in Bethany's eyes. She glanced at Andre. Was it possible? Was it possible this was all some elaborate legal threat? Some way for me to get a small settlement? The will is legal. It is binding, Mr. Rowe continued. And it clearly states that you, Andre Vaughn, are the sole beneficiary of her entire estate, 100% of it. Bethany let out a small, sharp gasp, a sound of relief. See? She whispered, her hand gripping Andre's arm. See, Andre, it's okay. It's just a trust. It's ours. Mr. Rowe held up a single long finger. Please, I have not finished. Bethany's mouth snapped shut. You, Andre, inherit everything, Mr. Rowe said, but you seem to be confused about what an estate is. An estate is a legal entity, and before a beneficiary inherits a single dollar, a single chair, a single memory, the estate has a legal primary duty. Its first obligation is to settle all outstanding debts, all liabilities, all claims. Only the net value, the amount left over after all debts are paid, is distributed to the heirs. He paused, letting the words hang in the silent room. And, he continued, as we have just definitively established with contracts, witnesses, and videotaped evidence, Mrs. Landry's estate has a primary, senior, and fully documented liability, a debt of $34,212,450. He tapped the old blue file. A debt owed in full to Mr. Julian Vaughn. Bethany's face went slack. The flicker of hope was extinguished. So, Mr. Rowe said, all business now. We must by law settle this debt first. He looked at Andre. Unfortunately, the total value of the assets in the estate is $34,212,450. Andre's face was chalk. He was doing the math. He understood. This means, Mr. Rowe said, that the estate's largest asset and its largest debt cancel each other out, perfectly, to the dollar. So, Andre whispered, his voice cracking. So there's nothing. It's zero. No, Mr. Rowe said. He said it so quietly. No. Bethany repeated, her voice a tiny squeak. Mr. Rowe shook his head, a look of almost theatrical sadness on his face. No, I'm afraid it's not zero. He reached into his briefcase. Again, he pulled out a third file. This one was thin, just a few pages. You see, Mr. Rowe said, your mother, Mrs. Landry, was a woman who lived very well. She lived a $34 million lifestyle, but she did not, in fact, have $34 million. She was the trustee of it. So, to fund that lifestyle, the cars, the trips, the clothes, she had to leverage her own credit. He opened the thin file. It seems Mrs. Landry died with other debts. Debts in her own name. Debts that are also claims against her estate. He put his reading glasses back on. We have an outstanding balance on a Platinum American Express card for $82,410. Bethany made a small choking sound. We also have, he continued, an outstanding auto loan on her 2024 Mercedes S-Class. She was, as the term goes, underwater on the loan. The car is worth less than the amount owed. The outstanding liability is $40,100. He looked up, his face grim. These, too, are debts of the estate, which must be paid. He pulled a small silver calculator from his coat pocket and placed it on the table. The clicking of the buttons was the only sound. It was the most brutal, clinical, devastating sound I have ever heard. So, let us do the final accounting, Mr. Rowe said. Total assets, $34,212,450. Click, click, click. Minus the primary liability owed to Mr. Julian Vaughn, $34,212,450. Click, click, click. That, he said, leaves a balance of 0. But we are not finished, he said. We must now subtract the American Express debt, minus $82,410. Click, click, click. And the Mercedes loan, minus $40,100. Click, click, click. He turned the calculator around for Andre to see the final glowing red number. This means, Mr. Vaughn, that your mother's estate is in fact insolvent. It has a net negative value. The total outstanding unsecured debt is $122,510. Andre and Bethany just stared. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But, Mr. Rowe said, and his voice was soft again, the will is still valid. You, Andre, are the sole and undisputed heir. He looked Andre right in the eye, the final fatal blow. So congratulations, Mr. Vaughn. You have officially and legally inherited your mother's entire estate. You have inherited a debt of $122,510. The silence in the room was no longer just silence. It was a vacuum. It sucked all the air, all the hope, all the life out of the world. Then Mr. Rowe turned to me. Julian, he said, his voice warm for the first time in 40 years. As the primary creditor, the full $34,212,450 will be transferred from the estate's accounts into an account of your choosing. My office will have it done by 5 p.m. tomorrow. And then, he reached into his own pants pocket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it. He carefully, deliberately removed a single crisp $1 bill. He placed it on the gleaming mahogany table, and with one finger he slid it across the vast empty space to me. And this, he said, his voice laced with an irony so profound it was almost holy. This is from the will, to make it all official. I looked at the single dollar. I looked at Andre, a living statue of suffocating ruin. I looked at Bethany. She was staring at the dollar bill. Her mind, shattered by the millions, was suddenly able to focus on this one tiny ultimate insult, the $1 I was given, while her husband owed over $100,000. Her face, which had been pale as death, began to turn a dark, blotchy red. Her eyes, wide and vacant, began to focus. Her chest started to heave. Air, hot and ragged, flooded back into her lungs. She opened her mouth, and she screamed. It was not a word. It was not a cry of sadness. It was a raw, primal animal howl of pure, unadulterated, devastating loss. It was the sound of a future vaporizing. It was the sound of greed choking on its own bile. No! The scream echoed off the glass and the mahogany. It was a sound I would never ever forget. Bethany's scream was not human. It was a sound from a deep, dark animal place. It was the sound of a predator that had just had its kill ripped from its jaws. It filled the room, bounced off the mahogany, and vibrated in my teeth. She stayed like that for a second, frozen, her mouth open in that perfect O of horror, her face a mask of crimson. Then she moved. She didn't just stand up, she lunged. She lunged across the table, not at me, not at Gideon Rowe, but at the papers. She was like a wildcat, her manicured claws out, trying to swipe the old blue trust agreement off the table. You can't, she shrieked, her voice tearing. That's ours, give it to me. It's a fake, it's a forgery. Gideon Rowe was faster. He didn't even flinch. He simply placed one large, calm hand on the document, holding it in place. Mrs. Vaughn, he said, his voice level, I suggest you control yourself." "Control myself!" she screamed, pounding her fists on the table. You crooked old man. You've been planning this. Both of you. This was a setup, a con." Mr. Rowe pressed a small, discreet button on an intercom on the desk. "Brenda," he said, his voice perfectly calm, "please send security up to the 12th floor conference room. Mrs. Vaughn is unwell." "Security," Bethany shrieked, backing away from the table. "You're calling security on me? He just stole $34 million. She turned her eyes wild, scanning the room for an ally, for someone to fight, and her eyes landed on the one person she could hurt, her husband. Andre was still sitting. He was a statue. He was a man carved from ash. He hadn't moved. He was just staring at the red number on the calculator. 122,510, a number that was now his. "Andre," Bethany said, her voice dropping from a shriek to a low, venomous hiss. "Andre, do something." He didn't move. He didn't even blink. "Andre, look at me," she snapped. She walked over and slapped him, not a small tap, a full, open-palmed, resounding slap across the face. The sound was as shocking as her scream. Andre's head snapped to the side. A red handprint bloomed on his pale, ashen cheek. He slowly, very slowly turned his head back to look at his wife. His eyes were vacant. "Don't you just sit there," she raged, her voice breaking with hysteria. "Don't you just sit there like a child. Your father," she spat the word at me, this tramp, just stole our entire life. He stole our future. He stole our children's future. And you are just sitting here." "Bethany," Andre whispered, his first word. It was just a breath. "Bethany, it's legal." "Legal!" she shrieked. "Who cares if it's legal? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Andre, tell me, you're the finance genius. You're the big investor. What are we going to do?" She was grabbing the front of his $5,000 suit, shaking him, and in that moment, the final mask fell away. The curtain was pulled back. And I finally understood. This wasn't just about greed. This wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about something else. "You promised me," she screamed, her face inches from his tears of pure, undiluted rage streaming down her cheeks. "You promised me this was a sure thing. You promised me your mother had it all locked down. You promised—" Andre was just shaking his head, his eyes squeezed shut. I thought she told me." "You thought!" Bethany shrieked. And this was it. This was the final devastating drip-fed piece of truth. "What about the house, Andre? What about the second mortgage? How are we going to pay that back? I told you it was too risky. I told you to wait." My blood went cold. A second mortgage. "And the club?" she continued, her voice dissolving into a sobbing, hysterical rant. "What about the down payment for the club? We borrowed against the portfolio. We borrowed against money. We didn't even have you. You idiot, you stupid, arrogant, weak little boy. You've ruined us. You've ruined me." It all clicked into place. The expensive suits, the cars, the arrogance, the desperation for me to be there to be a witness. They weren't just waiting for a windfall, they were drowning. They had been living a $34 million lifestyle on credit, assuming the money was already theirs. They hadn't just counted their chickens before they hatched. They had mortgaged the farm, sold the eggs, and burned the hen house, all on a promise. And Denise, with her final cruel $1 bequest, had not just insulted me. She had, in her arrogance, confirmed the very story that triggered the 40-year-old legal bomb that had just vaporized her son's entire world. The door to the conference room opened. 2 large men in professional blue security uniforms stepped inside. "Mr. Rowe, you called?" "Yes, Thomas," Mr. Rowe said calmly, standing up. "I believe Mrs. Vaughn is in need of some fresh air. She is having a difficult time processing the news." Bethany looked at the security guards. She looked at Rowe. She looked at me. And then she looked at her husband, who was still just a shell, a red handprint on his face. She let go of his suit, her hands dropping to her sides. All the fight, the screaming, the energy just vanished. It was gone. She was hollowed out. She looked pathetic. We're ruined," she whispered to herself. It's all gone. We're ruined." She began to sob, not the loud, angry sobs from before, but the quiet, broken, hopeless sobs of a person who has just seen the absolute end of their world. "Ma'am, if you'll come with us," one of the guards said, gently taking her arm. She didn't resist. She was completely limp. She let them guide her out of the room, her quiet sobs echoing in the hallway until the heavy door clicked shut, leaving a profound, deafening silence in its wake. It was just me, Gideon Rowe, and my son. Andre hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the chair, his head bowed. He was staring at his hands, which were clasped on the table. He was a broken man. I had come here expecting to be humiliated. Instead, I had just witnessed the complete and total disintegration of my son's life. I felt nothing. Not joy, not pity, not anger. Just a vast, cold emptiness. Mr. Rowe began to quietly pack his briefcase. He placed the old blue file inside. He placed the flash drive inside. He placed Denise's will inside. He was giving us a moment. I stood up. My knees cracked. I was a 71-year-old man. I was tired. I reached over and picked up the single crisp $1 bill. I folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of my old suit. I turned to leave. I had my answer. I had my $34 million. I had my dollar. It was over. "Dad." The voice was so small I almost didn't hear it. It was a word I hadn't heard him say in I couldn't remember how long. Not like that, not with that tone. I stopped. I turned. Andre was finally looking at me. His face was a wreck. The red handprint was stark against his pale skin. His eyes were no longer the cold, arrogant eyes of the man who had walked in here. They were the eyes of a 5-year-old boy, the boy I used to know, the boy I had given up everything to protect. They were terrified, they were desperate, and they were filled with tears. "Dad," he whispered again, the word cracking in his throat. "Please, you can't." He stood up, his legs shaking. He looked at me, his hands half raised in a gesture of surrender. You can't do this to me. Please. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. She lied to me. My whole life." He was crying now, big, choking sobs. "Please, Dad," he begged. I'm ruined. I'm your son. I'm your son. You can't take it all. I'll have nothing. Please. I'm your son." I stood by the door, my hand on the heavy brass knob. Andre's weeping the wet, ragged sobs of a man whose entire world had just been pulled out from under him filled the silence. "I'm your son." The words hung in the air, a desperate last-ditch attempt to find a key that still fit a lock that had rusted shut decades ago. I turned around slowly. My hand fell from the doorknob. I looked at him, really looked at him. The man in the $5,000 suit, his face streaked with tears, a red handprint blooming on his cheek. This was the same man who not 30 minutes ago had sat in that same chair, his eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction as he watched me be publicly legally defined as a $1 failure. The same man who had let his wife mock me for the bus I took to get here. The same man who waited a week to tell me his mother was dead only so he could stage this little piece of theater. "My son," I said. My voice was not angry. It was not sad. It was tired. It was a voice hollowed out by 40 years of disappointment. "You use that word now. You use it as a shield, as a final bargaining chip." His sobbing hitched. He looked up at me, his eyes wide pleading. "You didn't use that word this morning, Andre," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire room. "You didn't use it when you called me about the instructions. You haven't used it, not really, not in 20 years. You traded that word away, son. You traded it for the $34 million. And you just lost the trade." "I didn't know," he cried, his voice breaking. "Dad, I swear to God, I didn't know. She lied to me. She lied about everything, about you." You didn't know the facts, I said, taking a step back toward the table. You're right. You didn't know about TCT. You didn't know about the trust. You didn't know your father was a titan, as Mr. Rowe called him. But you knew me. Or you should have. You knew I was not a weak man. You knew I was not a failure. You knew I was an honest man. But it was easier to believe the lie, wasn't it? I looked at him. It was more comfortable to believe your father was a failure because that meant the money, the houses, the lifestyle, was rightfully your mother's, and by extension, rightfully yours. It made the story clean. The successful mother, the deadbeat dad, you, the deserving heir. I leaned on the table, my hands flat on the polished wood. Mr. Rowe told you about the lawsuit, but he didn't tell you the end of the story. You heard Bethany. You heard your mother's will. I was a catastrophic failure, a man whose incompetence cost the company. I looked at Gideon Rowe, who was standing silently, a sentinel of truth. He gave me a single slight nod. The floor was mine. I fought Taggart Consolidated Trades for 2 more years after I signed that trust. I said, my voice low. After I gave your mother every penny, I countersued them. I lived in a 1-room apartment in Alexandria. I sold my car. I sold my watch. I represented myself for the last 6 months because I couldn't even afford a lawyer. And in 1987, I won. Andre's head snapped up. His tears stopped. You won. Oh yes, I said. A bitter, dry laugh escaped my throat. I won. A federal judge ruled that the TCT lawsuit was, and I quote, a frivolous, malicious, and racially motivated act of corporate sabotage. I was completely and totally vindicated. The ruling said I was a victim, not a failure. So what happened? Andre stammered. If you won, why am I me? I finished for him. Why do I live in Anacostia? Because winning in court and justice in the world are 2 very different things, son. By the time I won, it was 2 years too late. Vaughn Construction was a ghost. It was bankrupt. My reputation was destroyed. My contacts were gone. My credit was ruined. TCT had already won the federal contract they set out to steal. They had bled me dry, and all I had to show for it was a piece of paper that said I was right. A piece of paper and that blue trust agreement. I took a deep breath. This was the part I had never spoken aloud, to anyone. I went to your mother. I went to the Georgetown house, the house I paid for. I sat in the living room. You were 7 years old. You were upstairs playing. I could hear you. I showed her the court ruling. I said, Denise, I won. It's over. I'm vindicated. Now, please, give me my money back. Give me half of it, just enough to start again. I can rebuild it all. For us. For Andre. Andre squeezed his eyes shut. He put his hands over his ears. No, don't. She laughed, I said. My voice was hard as steel. He flinched. She sat there on a sofa I had bought and she laughed. She said, Julian, you didn't win. You just survived, and barely. You're a pariah. Your name is Mud. This, and she said the word, my money is the only thing that kept me and my son safe from your scandal. It's my reward for having to endure your humiliation. It's not your capital. It's my security. No, she wouldn't, Andre moaned, shaking his head. She would, I said. And she did. And then she delivered the final blow. The one that put me in that apartment for 40 years. She said, if you ever try to fight me on this, if you ever so much as whisper the words trust agreement again, I will take Andre. I will move to Paris, and I will tell him his father died of a drug overdose in a back alley. You will never see your son again. I looked at the broken man in the chair. So I made a choice, Andre. I chose you. I let her have the money. I let her have the lie. I let her turn you into this arrogant stranger who looks at his own father with contempt. I sacrificed my money. I sacrificed my legacy. I sacrificed my own name, just for the chance to get a text message on my birthday. I let her raise you to believe I was a failure because I was terrified of losing you completely. He had no answer. He just wept. You sat right there, Andre. I said, my voice quiet again. You sat in that chair and you smirked. You smirked while your mother's lies were read aloud. You looked at me with pleasure as I was slandered. You were happy to see me humiliated. You didn't just inherit the lie, son. You participated in it. You enjoyed it. You enjoyed it right up until the moment that old blue file hit the table. Dad, I'm ruined, he whispered again, a pathetic final plea. Bethany, the house, the debt. I'll have less than nothing. Yes, I said. You will. You will have what I had in 1987, less than nothing. You will have a piece of paper that says you are right, that you are the rightful heir to a mountain of debt. You will have what your mother truly left you, the consequences of your own choices. You will, for the first time in your life, be exactly like your father. He looked at me, his eyes begging for an answer, for mercy, for me to fix it. I saw the 5-year-old boy I had given up an empire for. And I saw the 45-year-old man who had sold my drafting tools for pocket money. I was tired. 40 years of tired. I turned away from him. I straightened my old worn-out suit jacket. I felt the crisp folded $1 bill in my pocket. My legacy. I walked to the head of the table where Gideon Rowe was standing, waiting, his face impassive. Andre was holding his breath. The entire world was holding its breath. I looked my old friend, my old lawyer, in the eye. The man who had kept my secret for 4 decades. The man who had just handed me back my life. Mr. Rowe, I said, my voice clear, steady, and firm. Please proceed. Proceed exactly as the trust agreement and the law demand. Julian, no. Dad. Andre's voice was a torn-out guttural cry. I did not turn around. Transfer the funds as you described, I said. Mr. Rowe nodded. A single short, profound gesture of respect. It will be done, Julian. Thank you for your time, I said. I turned, walked past my son, who had collapsed onto the table, his head buried in his arms, his body racked with the terrible sobs of a man who had just lost everything. I did not look back. I opened the heavy mahogany door, and I walked out into the hallway, a free man. I walked out. I didn't look back. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut, and the sound of my son's desperate, broken weeping was cut off as if by a knife. The hallway was silent, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of my footsteps. It was just me and Gideon Rowe standing by the elevator. We didn't speak as we descended the 12 floors. The only sound was the quiet, expensive hum of the machinery. Mr. Rowe looked straight ahead, his face composed, his duty done. He had been the keeper of my truth for 40 years. He had held the key to my prison. When the doors opened onto the vast, sunlit lobby, I felt lighter. I was the same 71-year-old man in the same 25-year-old suit. But I was no longer a ghost. I was no longer a failure. I felt solid. We stopped at the massive glass doors. The city bustled outside. The funds will be in your account by end of day tomorrow, Julian, Gideon said. He extended his hand. I took it. His grip was as firm as it had been that morning, but his eyes were different. They were proud. Gideon, I said, my voice thick. 40 years. You kept that tape. You kept that promise. He smiled a small, genuine smile. Lawyers keep records, Julian. Friends keep promises. You were a good man who was robbed. I just held on to the receipt. Thank you, I said. It was the only word big enough. Go build something, Julian, he said. It's what you do. He turned and walked back toward the elevators, and I pushed open the glass doors and walked out into the air. It had never felt so clean. The numbers that appeared in my new bank account the next day were abstract. They didn't feel real. For a week I did nothing. I sat in my small apartment in Anacostia. I listened to the drip, drip, drip of the kitchen faucet, the sound that had been the rhythm of my failure. Now, it was just a leaky faucet. On the 8th day, I went to the hardware store. I bought a new compression fitting, a seat wrench, and a small roll of plumber's tape. I went home, shut off the water, and in 15 minutes the dripping stopped. The silence was absolute. Then I packed one small suitcase, left the keys on the counter, and walked out. I didn't buy a mansion in Georgetown. I had no interest in living in Denise's monument to a lie. I leased a penthouse apartment in a new clean glass and steel building overlooking the Potomac. It was quiet. It had a balcony. I bought a few pieces of solid, comfortable furniture. I bought new clothes, not expensive, but new. I bought a new truck. A big, dark blue Lincoln Navigator. It was the first new car I had owned since 1984. I spent my days walking by the river. I spent my nights reading. I was 71 years old, and for the first time in 4 decades, I felt at peace. The $34 million wasn't a prize, it wasn't a victory, it was ballast. It was the weight of my own life finally returned. 3 months passed. 3 months of total profound silence. Then my new phone rang. It was an unknown number, a local Virginia prefix. I answered. Hello. There was a long silence on the other end, just ragged breathing. Dad. I almost didn't recognize the voice. The arrogance was gone. The cold, clipped, businesslike tone was gone. The panic and rage I'd heard in Rose's office, that was gone too. This voice was thin. It was hollow. It was the voice of a man who had been scraped clean right down to the bone. Andre, I said. Yeah, he whispered. Hi, I'm... He couldn't get the words out. He just breathed. I figured you might call, I said. My voice was calm, neutral. She left me, he stammered the words rushing out in a quiet torrent. Bethany, she left the day the bank notices started arriving. She took the kids. She's in Connecticut with her mother. Her lawyer called me. She's suing me for child support, but I don't have anything. You have the debt, I said, not cruelly, just stating the fact. He let out a terrible dry laugh. It sounded like a cough. Yeah, I have the debt. The $122,000, the banks took the house. Of course, the club investment, that was a sham. The other investors, they're suing me for fraud. He took a sharp, ragged breath. I lost my job. Of course. My face was in the paper. Vaughn Air inherits negative fortune. It was a big joke. I've been living in a motel in Alexandria, near the highway. He paused and his voice broke. They locked me out this morning. My last credit card was declined. He was quiet again. I didn't speak. I just listened. Dad, he whispered, and the word was desperate. I haven't eaten in 2 days. I sold my watch. I sold my suit. I sold my shoes. I'm at a bus stop. I've got nothing. I've got nothing left. He was crying now, the quiet, exhausted sobs of a man at the absolute end. I'm sorry, he whispered. That's why I called. I know I don't deserve anything. I know that. I wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. I was an idiot. I was a terrible son. I didn't know who else to call. I looked out my vast, clean window. I watched the Potomac River wide and brown and steady flowing to the sea. I saw the man who had smirked at me, the man who had sold my tools. And I heard a 5-year-old boy. He was telling the truth. He was at zero. He was at less than zero. He was for the first time in his life exactly where I had been in 1987. I let out a long breath. Where are you, Andre? I pulled up in my new, quiet, leather-scented truck. He was sitting on a metal bench under a flickering streetlight. It was a stranger. A thin, hunched-over man with a patchy, graying beard. He was wearing jeans and a thin jacket, and he was shivering. He looked old. He looked older than me. He saw the big, expensive truck pull up. He saw me behind the wheel. And the look on his face, it was a terrible, profound, crushing shame. He looked down at his own broken shoes. He couldn't meet my eyes. He got in. The door closed with a heavy, solid thunk. He smelled of sweat and fear in the street. He just sat there, his hands in his lap, staring at the clean, glowing dashboard. "Thank you," he whispered. I didn't say anything. I just drove. I didn't drive back toward my new fancy penthouse. I drove back over this bridge, back into the city, back toward Anacostia, back toward my old life. He must have recognized the streets. He finally looked up, his face filled with confusion. "Dad, where are we going?" "I've been busy, Andre," I said, my voice even. "I'm a builder. It's what I do. I can't just sit still. I have to be building something." I pulled up in front of a familiar building, my old apartment building, the one with the cracked linoleum and the peeling paint. But it was different. The front steps were clean. The graffiti was gone. There was scaffolding up the side and a large construction dumpster out front. A new, simple, dignified sign was hanging by the door. "The Vaughn building." Andre just stared, his mouth open. You bought this. Why?" "It's a foundation," I said, putting the truck in park. "I bought it a month ago. The structure is good, solid bones. It's just been neglected. Needs work, a lot of it." I turned to him. I looked him right in the eye. "I need a property manager, someone to live on site. The basement apartment is empty. It's not much, but it's warm." He was staring at me, not daring to hope. You're offering me. I'm offering you a job, Andre," I said, my voice hard. "Minimum wage. You handle the tenants. You schedule the repairs. You collect the rent. You learn the business from the ground up, from the basement up." He was crying again. But these weren't the tears of a ruined heir. They were something else. "Dad, I don't know how to do any of that." "You'll learn," I said. "I'm not giving you $1 of that 34 million. That's my money. That's my legacy. You want a future. You have to build it, just like I did, from nothing." I got out of the truck. I walked around to the back and opened the hatch. I pulled out a brand new red steel toolbox. "You can start tonight," I said. He slowly got out of the truck, looking at the heavy box. Start what?" I handed it to him. It was heavy. His arms, weak and thin, strained to hold it. "Your first job," I said. I pointed up to the third floor. "Apartment 3B, Mrs. Rodriguez, her kitchen faucet. It's been dripping for 40 years. Go fix it." He looked at the heavy toolbox in his hands. He looked at the old building. Then he looked at me. And for the first time in his life, he didn't look like a rich kid. He didn't look like a failure. He just looked like a man about to go to work. He nodded, just once, a small, jerky, broken motion. "Okay, Dad," he whispered. "Okay." I watched him walk into the building carrying the tools. I had my money. I had my name. I had my peace. I had lost a son who despised me. And I had just hired a man who might, one day, be worth knowing. The order was restored. This whole ordeal taught me a powerful lesson. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of waiting. For 40 years, a lie defined my life and my son's. But the facts kept safe in an old file and an old friend's memory never expired. It taught me that your real value isn't what people say about you, but what you build, what you stand for, and the integrity you refuse to sacrifice. A life built on a foundation of greed and deception will always collapse. True restoration isn't about the money, it's about rebuilding your life and sometimes your family from the ground up. What would you have done in my position? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please like and subscribe for more stories like this.